interject within it some politics that I'd like to pass to you, and that way nobody could have repeated my personal story. But my personal story, as I assume many Palestinians, is not unique in a way. The personal story with its politics and the luggage that it carries is kind of a story that many different Palestinians from different walks of life can claim. As was said, I'm a Palestinian American. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. So I'm a Palestinian that doesn't hold any kind of paperwork to say that I'm Palestinian, or at least that was the case when I first came. I should put a footnote that my father, who's with me today, he actually left Palestine in 1956, long before the 1967-day war. Why is that important? Because when my father reached the States with whatever paperwork he had to be able to exit Palestine, when the occupation happened, one of the first acts of the occupation, I think the occupation took place in June. I believe what I'm going to tell you took place in, if I'm not mistaken, October. They held a full census. Anybody who was physically here got what we call in common language the Palestinian ID. In more technical language, got a residency card. So someone knocked on every door. You were physically here, here meaning the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or Gaza. You were issued a card by the Israeli military to give you residency status in your home. That should be the first place that we kind of think something awkward is happening. Think of somebody knocking on your door where you live, and then taking a census of who's in your family, and then formally applying on you a alien status. Because that's what a green card is. In the States, at least, we call it an alien card. It's a temporary status. So that's the beginning of what I'd like to start talking about. So my father, being in the States, occupation happened. He wasn't in Palestine. He wasn't here when the census took place. Did not receive a Palestinian ID card. Thus, could not come back to the home that he was born in. Had to become a U.S. citizen, get naturalized, become a U.S. citizen, which meant marrying my mom. And then, up until today, he's actually visiting. Up until today, can only visit Palestine like you, on a 3-month tourist visa. That's my dad. Come along, Sam, born in the U.S. I'm a U.S. citizen only. I have no claim to a Palestinian residency status. I become very active in student affairs in the States, especially when Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon happened. That was my first real wake-up call to this conflict. And then the first Intifada took place, and I started bringing groups like yours from the States to be eyewitnesses. And that gave me a huge learning experience from the ground level, traveling all the way from the occupied Golan Heights to the bottom tip of Gaza, learning a lot, being introduced to a lot of organizations and people, and that's really where the real value comes in. And that's why I respect groups as yours coming together for work camps, because that's the interaction that actually creates relationships that can change politics. Coming in and just seeing the sights and leaving, that's valuable, but I don't think you can become politically active in a real way by doing that. So basically, I, being active, came one year and got married to a Palestinian woman. When you're born here, you're automatically given that Palestinian ID. So if you were here in the census, you got it, but anybody born since then gets one. And we got married in 1993. One of the first things we did was we went to the Israeli military, and my wife requested that I be given residency status. Like in any of our countries, if you marry a foreigner, the national requested the foreigner gets a status so the family can stay together.
You're talking about the West Bank.
The West Bank. It actually applies to the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, right, supposedly. But I was in the West Bank at the time, so the Palestinian Authority was not set up yet. So we approached the Israeli military directly, and we applied. That was in 1993. They gave me a small receipt, and I cherished that receipt. It was in my wallet. And every Christmas when I got a new gift of a wallet, I would move that paper, the first one, because I didn't want to lose my receipt, which was my ticket to be able to stay with my family. And then I went back to the States with that receipt in hand, and I was working in software development at the time. And then Oslo took place, surprising everyone. And the Oslo Accords at the time, I mean, a lot of Palestinians say they didn't like it. I can actually claim I didn't like it and tell you to go read what I wrote at the time. I was very critical at the time, saying this agreement is lopsided, it's not ending the occupation, it's basically setting us up for failure. And that was one discussion. That was my discussion with the public and in my political analysis. And for those of you that are married, you know very well there's two kinds of discussions. One is your public discussion, and the other one is with your spouse. And the one with the spouse usually has a reality check in it. And basically, the reality check I got from my wife was, you know, we don't like this agreement. It's not going to end the occupation. But you know what? Whether we like it or not, it's going to happen. Could we make the best of it? And in discussing, one day in the Youngstown Vindicator, a very tiny newspaper in our community, they actually published a little blurb saying that Arafat was somewhere in the Gulf and he made his first economic declaration. He said, when I come back to Palestine, now that Oslo has been signed, one of the first economic steps that I'm going to do is to privatize the telecommunications sector. He didn't have so much foresight. He was basically broke and had no experience, so he had no option but to privatize the telecommunications sector. And that caught my attention because then I went and I got a copy of the Oslo Accords. I half-jokingly say that I'm one of 12 Palestinians worldwide that actually read the agreement. Everybody analyzes it, everybody, you know, badmouths it. Very few people have actually read it. I highly encourage you to read it, even though I believe it's a dead document today, and it's failed multiple times. But if you want to understand why we are where we are today, that 20 years was dictated by parameters from that agreement. And I think it's very important to know how it was structured exactly like I thought out in the beginning for our failure. So what I'm going to talk about very briefly is one annex of the Oslo Accords. And you can apply what I'm going to say to basically every sphere of life. The Oslo Accords, as you may know, is built around annexes. There's many, many annexes. Every sphere of life is an annex. The one that deals with telecommunications was Annex 36. So I had that one memorized, basically. The first paragraph is great. I couldn't have written it better myself. It says, the Palestinian side has the right to build, operate, and maintain separate and independent telecommunication networks. Those are the words that are used, separate and independent. That's not bad. All the first paragraphs of all the annexes were not that bad. It were the 4 pages that followed, which were all the buts. And of course, at the time of a White House lawn, nobody goes into the footprints or the footnotes and figures out the details. Everyone's reading the highlights of the agreement. The highlights were very great. And basically, the buts that had to do with telecom, I'd like to share them with you because they're very revealing about who really maintains control of this economy. Let me give you the first example. Do any of you know how these things work? I don't either. I just press some buttons and my mother answers in the US. These work on frequencies, right? There's no wires, it's frequencies. And not to get technical on you, let's pretend like frequencies are like lanes of a highway in the air. And the first thing we did when we showed up, I was hired by a private sector company that was putting together the telecom company. The first thing we did is we held a study. How much frequency do we need to build a proper telecommunication, a cellular network? We actually brought in some consultants from British Teleconsult, some very old-timers from British Teleconsult, and we thought their British accents would help us with the Israelis. Why? Because the agreement said, although you have the right to build separate and independent networks, when it comes time to get frequencies to actually do it, frequencies are the keys for this sector. You come back to the Israeli side, and we alone will decide if, when, and how much frequency to give you. So we took our friendly British accented British people, and we went to the Israeli side with big studies, and we told them our foreign consultants have advised us that we need, for the sake of our discussion, 6 lanes of the highway in the air, 6 bands of frequency, let's call them. The Israeli side took about, I want to say around 20 months. When I'm speaking tonight, keep in mind when I talk about this took 20 months and this took 20 years, that's a lot of time buying. They took about 20 months, they came back and they said, we've decided, based on all the information you've provided us, to allocate you 2.5 lanes, not 6. What does that mean? It means in our proper study, in our proper network diagram, It meant that what we wanted to do was to build a tower here, you know, those towers you see on the rooftops, and a tower here, and connect them with 6 lanes of the frequency. When they said we can only have 2.5, it didn't mean we couldn't build the network. It meant that instead of one here and one here, now we had to build a tower here, a tower here, and a tower here, because we had less frequency. So we had to have more, what they call in the sector, hops. Every time I say the word tower, think $500,000. Heavy additional cost. We took on that cost and invested in the network. Second restriction in Oslo, it said, how did this phone get to me in Ramallah? Or for that sake, how did you get to us in Ramallah or Anata? Every single piece of equipment or person who wants to reach the West Bank must come through Israeli-controlled ports. That didn't change. It was that way before Oslo, it's that way throughout Oslo, and now even Oslo failed, it's that way today. Some people think that Oslo gave us control of the borders. It did not. So this piece of equipment from Samsung had to come through the ports. Every single piece of equipment that comes through Israeli ports must jump through 3 hoops. Hoop number 1, customs. The Israelis said, we will collect your customs. Not only that, we're going to apply our custom rates. Remember, the Israeli economy is very modern. It's up here. We were just starting. It was very low. And they said, we will apply our custom rates to anything you bring in. We will collect that money on your behalf. We'll take a very hefty administration fee, and we'll pass your money to you. And then, if you followed the news, that became a tool to punish the Palestinians. If we were good Palestinians that month, we'd receive our money. If we were bad Palestinians that month, like we went to the UN, for example, to get membership, then the money would be held to punish us. And knowing that we are dependent on those funds, they knew that holding the funds means teachers and firemen and policemen don't get paid. But it was a very cruel kind of way to control the society. That was hoop number 2. Every product jumps through that hoop. I'm sorry, that was hoop number 1, the customs. Hoop number 2, standards. They said that anything you import into the Palestinian economy must apply Israeli standards. The standards for an economy which is very modern. We are an underdeveloped, not even a developing economy. To apply those standards, which are a modern economy standards, is a nice way of saying we're going to levy a cost on you above and beyond what you can afford. That's a fact of life. It applies until today. And the third hoop that everything jumps through is the one we love best because we can't explain it. It's security. We had equipment, not handsets, but the equipment that goes on the back of these big towers. We had equipment that we brought in which sat at the Israeli port for security reasons, whatever that means, for over 2 years. Sensitive telecommunications equipment, which happened to come on the same shipment that an Israeli company ordered the same equipment. Theirs cleared in 3 weeks. Ours sat there. While it sits there, we pay the Israeli side what they call demurrage fee, which is storage fee. So we're paying for our equipment to sit in storage at the port where we're waiting for an undefined definition of security to be applied. That case itself that I'm talking about actually got into a lawsuit, which I think is still pending. We've filed lawsuit against them for holding up our equipment. So that was a second restriction, the frequencies being one, and all 3 of those in terms of how we import goods, another. A third one, and I'll stop here on this issue, a third one was, I assume you've seen maps and you're aware of what areas A, B, and C are? Yes? Well, the agreement said, if you want to create any kind of connection between areas A and area A, like Ramallah and Bethlehem, for sure we have to go through area C because no 2 areas A are connected. Area C is 62% of the West Bank. The agreement said every time you want to make a connection, a fiber optics cable, a microwave link, any connection through area C, you come back to our side every single time to get permission. Why is that a big deal? Because for the 30 years of occupation before Oslo, the telecommunications sector was in full, like everything else, in full Israeli hands. And the way they designed the network was the following. I live in a 3-story home. I live in the middle floor. My in-laws happen to live downstairs, and my father and mother have a floor upstairs when they come to visit. If I wanted to call my dad upstairs, the call would go to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and then be transferred back upstairs. The network was designed to make sure there was an Israeli component in it for security reasons, for whatever reasons. When we came, we said separate and independent means something to us. When we call from Ramallah to Ramallah, we want it to be a local call. Not only that, we want to connect Ramallah to Bethlehem. We don't want that call to go to Tel Aviv either. And every single time until today that we want to connect two places, we have to go to the Israeli side and get permission. Now, all those restrictions that I spoke about, they were the small print in Oslo. At that time, when we faced these issues, already the White House lawn handshake had been done. The newspapers were already bored with the issue. We were left on our own. We and the imbalance of power with the Israeli military trying to convince them. And it's not only the Israeli military. There is no military here that works outside of a political government. It was us with the Israeli government. And that's important. I'll come back to it at the end. Back to my story quickly. I said I came here as a tourist because as an American citizen, there's no other way to come. My wife came back to her home with her Palestinian ID. I came as a tourist, like you. I had to leave the country every 3 months to get a visa because they give, I think now they give you cards, but before they used to actually stamp the visa in the passport. And the stamp itself has 3 months written in it. So 3 months would end, I'd have to leave the country to Jordan, to the States, wherever, and come back in to renew my visa. And every single time, really going through the brain-racking reality that I may not be able to come back in. When my kids were young, it was okay. I dealt with it. Because the kids were, young. As far as they were concerned, Dad is going out of the country. He's going to stop at the duty-free and bring us chocolate. Dad can go out of the country every day. I mean, they had no problem. When they started getting older, they started to understand, wait, Dad is not leaving because he wants to. Dad is forced to leave. And he may not come back. And for those of you that are parents, you can understand the toll that that takes on a parent. So I did that for 15 years. And I actually brought some show and tell, just to make the point. This is my passport. It's like any foreign passport that you have. The only difference is I have more pages. Because when we request passports, we immediately ask for more pages. Because we know that we have to go in and out of the country frequently. So this is the 4th passport. I have 3 more at home full of stamps. And basically, I did that for 15 years. And then something happened. And if you recall, Arafat died or was killed. We don't know. And then people were worried. What's going to happen? Is this place going to collapse? And in 2005, we elected a new president, President Mahmoud Abbas. And that was kind of like a sigh of relief that it didn't collapse. There was a process. A new president has been installed. And then the American side came to us, the Bush administration specifically. And basically, they were pretty, happy campers. They came and said, Arafat's gone. That's great. We didn't like him too much. And now that you have a new president, it's time to bring democracy to Palestine. And we have a great track record in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now it's your turn. And the way we're going to start is like we start everywhere. You start with elections. And I can remember the Palestinian side at that time telling the U.S. administration officials, hey, slow down. Arafat was everything. He was the icon. He was the money. He was the politics. We need time to build institutions because, thank God, Abbas is not that kind of a person. And the U.S. side wanted nothing to do with it. They said, you have elections or you lose the funding. So we had elections. And we learned pretty quickly. It's one of our bad traits. And as we learned how to have elections, the U.S. sent us Jimmy Carter and a whole slew of people who verified that the elections were democratic and proper and kosher. And during the process, something very bold happened. Hamas, the Islamist group, decided that they're going to run in the elections. Why was that news? Because up until that point, for 15 years, Hamas refused to deal with anything that had to do with Oslo. And as I said, Oslo was many annexes. One of the annexes of Oslo was how the Palestinians will have elections. And they felt slanted that we don't want the Israelis dictating to us how to elect our leadership. So they ignored it for 15 years. For some reason, discussion for a different day, they decided we're going to run. And you should have saw the American administration officials were grinning ear to ear. They were boasting. See, Palestinians? Oslo's not that bad. Even Hamas came to their senses and now are dealing with the brainchild of Oslo, the elections. And that was a period of time which was very interesting because the US was almost boasting about, they were boasting. And then election day came. And what happened? Hamas won. And then the grin became frowns and the US became totally at unease, not knowing what the hell to do. At that point they made, and I don't say this very enthusiastically because as a very secular Palestinian, I'm convinced until today that our community is a rather secular community in terms of its politics. Because Hamas won does not mean the society has turned Islamist from a political perspective. It also doesn't mean that secular people don't pray, right? But the US took a strategic wrong decision. They didn't allow Hamas to govern. I actually think if Hamas was allowed to govern, they would have fell on their own weight. Because running a chain of mosques is very different than running a country, especially one that's in a conflict. But they didn't give them that chance. The US basically did something that was never done before. They boycotted the people under occupation. Usually it's the occupiers that get boycotted. We became the target of boycott. When that happened, the Israelis also wanted to punish us. And they did many things. One in specific that relates to me is that they found people like me, and there's thousands of us in our community, who came back after the Oslo process, who are foreign nationals, from all different walks of life. And they basically said, without saying, because the occupation doesn't put a notice in the paper for what they're going to do, they just do it, and you learn by practice. And they started to do the following. When people like me were leaving the country to come back to get their visas renewed, like we've been doing for the last 15 years, they started to deny entry to people, individuals. One by one, we started to hear more and more cases of people getting a big red stamp that says denied entry. By the way, the word entry is spelled wrong, but that's a different story. And we started hearing this, and then we put ourselves into a campaign. It's called, unfortunately, it still exists today. You can find this at righttoenter.ps. Right to enter, not to be confused with the right to return. The right to return has to do with refugees. We're talking about the basic, very basic right of entering an occupied territory. I myself had my visa coming up for renewal. I had to take a decision. What do I do? I had two options. One is, I say, the hell with the visa. I'm staying here. I don't want a visa. That would have been a stupid thing to do, and I didn't do it. Because that meant any Israeli jeep that stops me, and there are many that stop us, they could, at that point, put me in the jeep and deport me without a visa. So that was a technicality I wasn't about to give the Israelis. Instead, this time I made a proper luggage and I went to Jordan for a couple of days. Why do I say I created a proper luggage? Because after 15 years, not only did I know everybody at the border by first name, but I had it down to a science. 4.5 hours from my house to the border. Amman is a pretty boring place, so I wouldn't even go there. I would have coffee at the border and come back. 4.5 hours, I'd be back home. This time I thought I might not be able to come back in. Very heavy toll in the family. I went out and came back in. To make a long story short, I got a visa. 7 hours of interrogation, they stamped me my visa, and they wrote, for the first time ever, in Arabic, English, and Hebrew, just in case I don't understand. I have this scanned on the website, you can check it. It says last permit. That was a wake-up call. The Israelis call visas permits. So as far as I was concerned, this is the last time I'm going to be able to come into Palestine. My wife's here, my daughters are here, my work is here. I've been here for 15 years. So basically I stopped work. I was a consultant at that point, and I said, I'm not going to do anything but resolve my residency issue. Because if I don't, I have to take a strategic decision of what I want to do. And I started lobbying left and right, not only in our campaign, but also I went to some very, very significant Israeli business people that I knew. I forgot to mention, in '97, I actually went to Tel Aviv University and got an MBA degree. I'll come back to that. But I went to someone who was related to that degree, and he's a very significant person. He passed away a couple years ago. His name is Benjamin Gaon. And I went to him and I said, listen, his company gave me a scholarship to go to this MBA program. And when I went to pick up the scholarship, he told me, Sam, we have, you've been selected, but we have one condition. This was a meeting that happened in Tel Aviv. And in the back of my head, the only thing I could think about is not another Israeli with another condition, even in academia. And he said, my condition is the following. We're going to give you a scholarship to go and get this degree on the condition that you don't take it and go back to the States. Because we want people to be trained to work here. And I just chuckled. I said, listen, if that's your only condition, you don't have to worry about it because I'm not going anywhere. Almost 10 years to the date, I went back to his office in Tel Aviv and I told him, I showed him all my papers and I said, I'm not going anywhere, but your government is forcing me out. And this guy went berserk. He actually was involved in appointing, or partially involved in appointing, the Minister of Interior in Israel, Ronnie something or other. He actually called his secretary and get Minister Ronnie on the line. I don't speak Hebrew, but on that call he used all the swear words in Hebrew that I know and more. So I guess it was a pretty tough call. And he told me, go away, come, write me up your case and send it to me and I'll call you in a couple weeks. I did that. After all that effort, he was able to get me, with all of his leverage, a 3-month extension. That was a second wake-up call. That if all that effort at the ministerial level can only get me an extension, this is serious. And then I got my ID. How did I get an ID? In 1993, way back when I applied and had that receipt in my pocket, what should have happened, given Israel is responsible for those people under occupation, they should have processed my file. In 6 months, in a year, they should have said, you have residency or you don't, so I can decide where I want to build my life. They didn't. Instead, they froze all of the application processing for everything, not just this issue. And they basically said, these are now negotiation cards. And when the Palestinians throughout Oslo, as you know, Oslo is not one thing, it's a process. And the failures of Oslo have names. Camp David, Wye River, Annapolis. These are the milestones that we can say were the detrimental downward track of Oslo. Well, in one of them, I think it was the Annapolis round, the Palestinian side, like recently, was not wanting to go to the negotiation table for 1,000 reasons, and probably all right reasons. And the Israelis basically said, listen, you come to the table and we'll process 30,000 applications for you. That put the Palestinian leadership in a very big bind. Do they remain politically correct and say no because we can't be bought? Or when they turned around and found 30,000 applications means 30,000 families that are basically telling the Palestinian leadership, if you don't take this deal, we are going to get kicked out, because they started putting last permit on our ID, on our passports. So at that point, the Palestinian leadership accepted to go to the table. I was on the third list. There was 3 lists of 10,000 applications. I got my ID on the third time. This is my ID. An ID is not a citizenship. An ID is a residency card. We call it a Palestinian ID. It has a beautiful Palestinian flag around it. It's a misnomer. There is nothing Palestinian about this ID. This is an Israeli military-issued residency card. It controls our movement and access. When they called me and told me my ID was ready, they told me, bring your passport. I told my wife, I'm worried about this. What do they want with my passport? This is a U.S. document. What do they want for this? I was scared they were going to take it from me. And it's my only citizenship. Remember, I have no other citizenship. So I went in my yellow-plated car, because I was a tourist at the time, and I drove to this office and took them my passport, showed it to her. She stamped the passport with a Hebrew stamp, this Hebrew stamp here, and she gave it back to me and gave me my ID and said, congratulations. I don't read Hebrew, so I went out and found somebody that did and told, what does this say? And it basically says, the holder of this foreign passport is a Palestinian resident, and there's a place here where you put the number, and they wrote my number of my ID. Basically what they did is they invalidated my passport here. Not in a technical sense. I'm still a U.S. citizen. My passport is still valid everywhere in the world. But the only place I can't be American is here, in Israel or the West Bank. There's something wrong with that equation. The only place I can't be viewed as an American is with our U.S. strategic ally. Now, if I go with you to the bus to Jerusalem, you all show your foreign passports. Well, I have a foreign passport, and I'll show mine. They'll open it up and find that stamp and tell me, take your passport back, where's your ID? So when I picked this up, I went back to my car. Going there, I was a totally legal driver. U.S. passport with a visa, with a tourist card, Israeli plated. When I picked this up and went back and sat in my car to go back home, I was a totally illegal driver. Why? Anybody who carries one of these is not allowed to drive a yellow plated car. Not in Israel, nor in the West Bank. Okay, so I sold my car. Anybody who has one of these is not allowed into Israel. I lost access to Tel Aviv University. And if any of you have an MBA degree, you know that you don't go for the degree itself, you go for the networking. And after I finished my degree in '97, I used to go about every 2 months back to the university campus because they would bring in very high-powered speakers that we would go and have free access to. I lost that access because I became a Palestinian. I used to use the airport for many, many years. I lost access to the airport. Anybody who carries one of these is not allowed to use the airport. I also at the time was a business consultant, as I am today. A third of my clients were in East Jerusalem, one of them being the Maqasid Hospital, the biggest hospital here. I lost access to my clients. I lost those 3 clients. Anybody who carries one of these is not allowed in East Jerusalem. Okay, so I started to absorb what it means. Even though I've been writing about it for 20 years, I started to absorb what it means to be a full Palestinian in the eyes of the Israelis. And then, just to fast forward, I started looking around the business community, and I found some of my friends were going to Jerusalem, my Palestinian friends. And I was like, how do you get to Jerusalem? And they said, oh yeah, there's a permit system. You get an invitation letter from an Israeli organization, and you bring 10 shekels in your application. There's a stupid application you fill out, and you present it to the Israeli side. And if you're lucky, they'll give you a permit. And if you get a permit, you can go to Jerusalem. You're not allowed to go in a car. You have to go by foot through the checkpoint, which is very humiliating. I assume if you haven't, please walk through the checkpoint like Palestinians do. Don't just ride through. I rode through for 15 years, looking at the checkpoints, knowing that there were not good things, but it's a very different thing to walk in like sheep within the turnstiles and within the fences and yelling Hebrew, yelling at you from speakers behind bulletproof glass. It's a very humiliating experience to go through. So if you get a permit, you can go to Jerusalem, but only through those checkpoints. So I got one. I went and I applied and did all they told me to do, and I got a permit. It's good for 1 day, from 5 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock at night. And it's only good for the place where my invitation came from. So I think this one was probably Jerusalem, so it means I can only go to Jerusalem. I can't be caught in Tel Aviv. Okay, that was a headache, but it got me to Jerusalem. So I learned how to do that, and I did it rather frequently. These are only some of my permits that I got. And then I heard from a Palestinian business friend of mine that he got a permit for 3 months. And I said, wow, that'd be pretty neat to get one permit that's good for 3 months. Look what's happening to me already. When I was a U.S. citizen, a foreigner here, I was spending about 95% of my time creating jobs and in the business community. That 5% was spent going in and out of the country trying to get visas updated, but most of my time was in business. The day I became a Palestinian, about 30% of my time now is getting a permit, getting an invitation letter, standing in line to submit it, standing in line to pick it up, standing in line to cross the checkpoint. They put me into the maze of occupation. And it's a maze that was designed to make our lives miserable. So I heard about this 3-month permit, and I said, I want one of those. And I went to apply. And I went and I did everything I thought I needed to do. I thought it was the same kind of application. And I went and the lady said, do you have a magnetic card? And as an American, you can understand, the first thing I thought about when they said magnetic card was what? Credit card. I thought they wanted my credit card. I went berserk. What do you mean? It was 10 shekels last time. What do you want my credit card for? And she's looking at me, what the hell's wrong with this guy? She goes, what's wrong? I said, you want my credit card, right? She goes, no, what are you talking about? I said, you said magnetic card. What are you talking about? And she shushed me away. I went back to a lobby of about 100 people outside. I said, what the hell's a magnetic card? And all my Palestinians outside also laughed at me, and he didn't know what a magnetic card was. I have one to show you. It's a card that you have to apply to the Israeli military. Here's my magnetic card. Right? So this is also issued by the Israeli military. This says I'm a Palestinian in the eyes of the Israelis. This says, rest assured, I will not explode in front of you. I've been security checked. So I'm a good Palestinian. This means I'm a Palestinian. This means I'm a good Palestinian. And now with these, I can go and apply for a permit. And I did, and I got one. After 3 months passed, I wanted another one. This was kind of, luxury of the occupation, I guess. And I went to apply. I took my 10 shekels and I took all the application and this and this and I went to apply and she said, no. I said, what do you mean no? I got one just 3 months ago and here's all the paper. I even got this just to get one. What's wrong? And she goes, do you have a businessman's card? I said, I absolutely do. I have one of the best business cards in Palestine. I designed it myself. It's very bright. And I gave her one and she, like, a different lady, of course, and she was like, where'd this guy fall out from? I said BMC. I said, I know English. You said businessman's card. This is my businessman's card. She said, go away. I went back and asked my friend, what's a businessman's card? It's not a business card. It's an Israeli-issued businessman's card. I don't have one to show you. I asked for it about 9 months ago. I'm still waiting for it. This says I'm a Palestinian. This says I'm a good Palestinian. The other one says I'm a businessman, good Palestinian. Having said all that, I didn't believe them because I know this occupation is arbitrary by nature. It's arbitrary by design. So I also sit on the board of a bank in Palestine, one of the bigger banks. And I went to, when you're a banker, you have a tie, and you're a different kind of person. You're not like, layman. You're a banker, right? And I went to the bank board, and I told the secretary of the board, do me a favor, send a letter to the Israeli military administration and ask for a 3-month permit for me. Because I can't get one myself. And I've been waiting for this businessman's card, and it's not showing up. She took a copy of this. Only a copy of this. She didn't see this. I wasn't there personally. There was no 10 shekels. There was no application. And she sent it to the Israeli administration, and I got, not 3 months, I got a 6-month permit. And this is what I use now to go to Jerusalem. It's arbitrary by design. It's not only the permit system. I can't tell you how long it takes to go from here to Bethlehem. It may take an hour. It may take 2 hours. Halfway there, a checkpoint may stop you and tell you to turn back. It's arbitrary by design. Now that I've bored you with my story, I want to go back and end on a couple political notes. Note number 1. I continue to use the word military occupation and occupation. That's a trick word. And I want to, and I'm sure you're fully aware of it given you're in a work camp in Palestine already, but occupation is defined by international law. It's a temporary state of affairs after a war. Can any of you convince me after 46 years this is a temporary state of affairs? I'm having a hard time to swallow that. Having said that, the Palestinians have swallowed that. It's stuck right about here. It's called the pill of international law. And we've become so good in international law, I can rattle off probably more UN resolutions than you ever want to hear. And it's all stuck right here. And we're waiting to see, does the other side and the international community accept that as the state of affairs? If it is, we're ready to swallow it, and we've proved it over and over and over again. The last time we proved it was at the UN, when 138 countries, on our request, gave us membership into the UN. So we've proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that we're able to accept international law, even though it's a huge pill and it's having a very hard time going down. But that's not the only game in town. Many Israelis, probably this government being one of them, don't accept this as a military occupation. Back in September, I believe in November, the Netanyahu government actually created a commission to go study this issue. And they came back with a report that's now sitting on Netanyahu's desk and he doesn't know what to do with it, which says, what's the world talking about? There is no occupation here. So if it's not occupation, what is it? Well, there's several other games that we can play. One game is the divine game. God gave us this land. Okay, well, we have a group on our side that thinks their God gave them this land as well. And most of us don't think God's a real estate agent to start with. So that's kind of like a never-ending discussion. There's another game. There's the historical game. The historical game is, we have a claim. Well, if we're talking about historical rights and claim, I think we have a rather overwhelming, strong claim to places like Nazareth and Haifa. A claim, a historic right that we're willing to forgive by swallowing the pill of international law. That's one of the games. There's another game. It's the game we hear a lot from Jewish American side. Get over it, Palestinians. You lost the war. You actually lost 2 of them. So just get over it and move on with your life. Look forward. Teach your kids about the future, not about your history. But they haven't read world history, because that's not how peoples react. If the game is might is right, then what you're really telling me is that my daughter in MIT should be taking nuclear science, so we can become also a nuclear power, so we can beat you in the next round. That's a never-ending game as well. Thus, the Palestinians are totally focused on international law to move forward. But we need to pick what game we want to play. It's not fair for anyone or international community to actually ask the Palestinians to play all the games at once. You know, I used to play basketball, football, wrestling, and ping pong, but I never played them at once. I need to know the rules of the game that we're in. And based on those rules, we can define our chances for success. So that's one message. Second message, as you're traveling around the West Bank, keep in mind you are only seeing about 35 to 40% of the Palestinian people, if that. We're the rest. The majority of Palestinians do not live under military occupation. That's a hard thing for some foreigners to understand, like the US government sometimes. The majority of Palestinians are outside of the occupation. You have 1.5 million almost sitting in Israel. They're Israeli citizens. You have about 5 million refugees and their descendants, given this has dragged on for 60 plus years, are sitting in border states literally 1 or 2 hours away from the homes that they fled. And then you have the diaspora community like my dad sitting in Ohio. That's the Palestinian people. And anyone serious about talking politics should be thinking about all the components, all the fragments of the Palestinian people. Because we didn't fragment ourselves out of desire. We were militarily fragmented by the force of the Israeli military. Gaza was forcefully separated from the West Bank. East Jerusalem is forcefully separated from the rest of the occupied territories. We are forcefully separated from refugees in Lebanon, etc., etc., etc. So if we're serious, and unfortunately the US government, when the PLO was won, today there's much internal conflict in the Palestinian world, but when the PLO was won, representing all Palestinians, we were Frankenstein. The US wouldn't talk to us. The more and more we become fragmented, i.e. 2013, the more and more the US becomes excited to help. To help what? To help a small component of the Palestinian people. In a way, it's reinforcing the fragmentation even more. So the Palestinian people are a whole, even though we're fragmented. That's lesson number 2 that I'd like to pass to you. And the third one is more on a positive note. Where are we heading? If we take the current trajectory, we're heading to a conflict, violent, like we've seen before. But I think something else might come out of what's happening. 2 things. First, I don't think the Kerry track can actually result into what it was made to do. It was made to do a final status deal, an end of conflict deal. That's what they're promoting. That will not happen. Hold me to it. I'm taking bets after the lecture if you would like to put your money with me. That cannot result in that deal. That doesn't mean something cannot come out of it. Yes, we can better the occupation. The road from here to Bethlehem has been paved by USAID. Actually, in our community, we know it as a road for donkeys. It was paved and they put reflectors on it. It looks very nice. We can make the life a little bit better under occupation. That could come out of this process. Even more, maybe some big projects can come out of it, but it won't end in a final status agreement. So where are we heading, especially as the right wing in Israel is gaining more and more traction? I think the new generation of Palestinians are much smarter than me and my parents and my grandparents. They won't repeat the same mistakes. What will they do? They will look back on history. And they're going to see a couple episodes in our history. Episode number 1 is 1948 onward. 1948 to us was like 100 9/11s on one day. We did what any community, including your own, would do if that happened to you. You try to fight your way back. And we proved for about 15 years that we don't know how to fight. Not only that, that we're up against an entity which is a nuclear power supported and armed to the teeth by the US and the UK. We were no match for Israel. So that was about 15 years episode. Then we shifted gears and we started to adopt international law language. And we learned international law and we did UN resolutions and the US would keep vetoing it over and over and over. That didn't work. So then the US side came and said, we know how to solve this for you. bilateral negotiations. You have to talk together. It's kind of like saying put the rapist and the raper in the room and let them work it out. Well, we were in the room for 20 years. We don't know how to work it out. And we don't know how to work it out to the point where we're not just sitting discussing. As we're discussing, Israel continuing to build a settlement enterprise, which is tremendous. We started the Oslo Accords with 100,000 settlers on the ground. Today we're at 600,000. So talking does have a price. It's not just let's talk and things will work their way out. So my children probably, and maybe even me, will look back and say, okay, we tried everything. Maybe there's one thing we didn't try. Maybe if we come to the Israelis and basically say, you win. You get it all. You get Israel, you get the West Bank, you get all the settlements, you get East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, you get all the Jordan Valley, you get all the frequencies, you get all the water, and you know what else you get? Us. Now, we heard you have free health care in Israel. Where do we pick up our card? And we want some of that free education, too. And what I'm saying politically is that we are at a fork in the road. We were at this fork previously as well. When we started armed struggle, the idea was one secular democratic state, all of Palestine, not the Green Line, all of Palestine. We shifted. When we hit the fork the first time, we took a two-state route. We're at the fork again. And we're at the fork which says, do we want to define our self-determination? I put 10 underlines under self. We don't have to ask anybody. We just need to get our own act together. And self-define our self-determination as either being statehood, as we started already at the UN, or civil rights. And I don't want to say it's a fear, but one of the expectations that we can have is the new generation will come and make the shift. And Israel knows this. The leadership in Israel talks about it. It's in the press. It's not in the press in your countries, but it's in the press in Israel. Basically saying that if the Palestinians choose civil rights over nation-state status, the game is over. It may take another 100 years civil rights struggle, but for all intents and purposes, the game is over. We are at that fork right now. And that's actually why I think Kerry and company are so excited to try to create some progress. Because they're seeing that fork and they're seeing the Palestinian leadership losing any kind of credibility to convince the Palestinians to stay on track of two states. Given every single Israeli leader today is telling you 2 states is over. So how can the Palestinian leadership... No, the Israelis are misled. It's really there, they just don't want to say it. It's not convincing the younger generation who has the entire world in their iPhone. Unlike our generations, where we didn't have the capacity to have solidarity and to know information, today you're in the demonstration and the rock is coming to you and you're sending a Twitter message before it hits you. That's a tool that's being used in terms of sharing of information. And that's why we come and speak to groups like yours. Because if this message gets out and the urgency of the message gets out, maybe we, civil society, can actually move our governments in the right direction. It's a huge task. But if not, we are not going to disappear. We're going to change strategies. And we'll still need your solidarity there as well. Other than that, everything is great. I'll stop there. Questions, comments, throwing your shoes, anything.
Well, I'll start.
Yeah, well,
No.
okay.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I guess coming from the point of I completely agree with the next fork in the road. How are Palestinian civil society organizing, and what are the future challenges as they try to make these connections and eventually demand to be subsumed within Israel with full equal rights?
In a nutshell, because
And can Palestinians really get behind that? And amongst the Palestinian society, how can you convince?
Okay.
That's kind of,
The Oslo process, as I said, was a deterioration over time. It didn't fall off a cliff. It walked down the cliff one step at a time. About halfway down the cliff, civil society saw that the leadership was going astray. The Palestinian leadership is talking about negotiations and peace process is a strategic decision, and the settlements are growing. And they also studied, and this is the generation I'm talking about, and they understood armed struggle is not going to do it. We can't win an armed struggle for all the reasons you know. So they decided, what tools can we use to change the equation? And when I say change the equation, I mean, how can we hold Israel accountable for its violations of international law? And they put together a campaign called Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction. It's not things that we invented. We didn't define those terms. We aren't the first to use them. They have been used over history, and we're just trying to employ them. Because if the international community tells Palestinians, don't be violent, don't have armed struggle, don't even go to the UN because that might create complications for Israel, what exactly do they expect us to do? Throw chocolate at the occupiers every day as they demolish houses? So the Palestinian civil society got a lot of traction in promoting boycott, divestment, and sanction, understanding that in my opinion, that campaign in itself is not going to bring Israel to its knees. That campaign is an educational platform to be able to bring up the issue of Palestine in your local communities. And I equate it, I mean, I was active in the Free South Africa movement. I equate it to the boycott that happened against Shell gas stations. You're probably too young to remember, but Shell gas stations in the US were everywhere at one time. When they took a decision to boycott Shell, what did they do? They gave every tiny community, including Youngstown, Ohio, where I'm from, a local rallying point to bring the apartheid to the front page. Because we then boycotted Shell in Youngstown, Ohio, and that's where we rallied. And we're trying to do the same thing, to rally civil society here and abroad around the issue of holding Israel accountable. Because if they're not held accountable, why should we expect them to do anything different? This occupation has been a tremendous, profitable enterprise for Israel. And Jeff worked on this, and I just saw, you probably saw the lab.
Yeah.
It's, you're listed at the end of it as well, I think. There's an Israeli filmmaker who actually produced recently, it's not online yet, but the website is there, a documentary about Israel's role in the arms industry. Amazing. I actually got a chance to screen it privately, and it's shocking. He went to senior people in the Israeli establishment, both Knesset members and in the military, and he went to exhibitions where all these Israeli armaments were on show, and he interviewed them, and they were so candid. Why is this industry so valuable for Israel? And this guy, Ephraim Snai, he says, you don't know? It's because these are tested weapons. We don't bring anything to the market unless they're tested. Where do they test them? Well, Gaza's a good testing area because nobody gives a shit about Gaza. The checkpoints that I go through are good testing areas because they're hidden in terminals that nobody actually sees. So civil society is basically saying, let's bring a cost on them. Let's make countries who buy their weapons embarrassed, uneasy. And so that's where civil society is picking up, but it's not only there. Civil society is also starting in a slow way to articulate a political horizon, because a lot of people have, because there's so little happening in our community activism-wise, people have latched onto BDS as if it's the only thing in town. But BDS is a tool. It's not a destination. So now the Palestinian youth, the younger generation, are starting to define, okay, with that tool, what political end do we want? And that's where the discussion comes out about, don't think that we're in a corner. We have many options, and one of them is to drop a statehood track and go to civil rights. But there's others as well. So that's where civil society is. It's starting to politically define an end game which can then be linked to the tools of holding Israel accountable. It's a complicated discussion. Being fragmented as a community does not allow us to operate in a normal way. For example, there is no one physical location that we can call Palestinians together to meet. So efforts, I mean, I'm involved in one of them. Efforts meet in Turkey, we meet in Cyprus, we meet in Jordan, and every time we're bringing different groups together, and thank God for Skype, we can actually, but that's a very difficult mobilizing environment to work in. And there's also a huge bottleneck that Jeff and I continuously talk about is the hesitation from the Palestinian side due to a lot of factors of linking up with peace activists within Israel. There's the wall is a physical separation, but there's a mental separation as well. And Palestinians, many of them in civil society, have said, we want nothing to do with the Israelis. And the Israeli government kind of likes that. Because the worst thing that they want are Palestinians and Israelis working together to end the occupation. So that's the mapping of that. It's a complicated one, but it is being worked on. There's actually somewhere I can point you to, the effort that I'm involved in. It's called the Palestine Strategy Group, and you can find us at palestinestrategygroup.ps. And there's 2 documents there, which are strategy documents. One is scenario planning, and one is more of a strategy document. And you can start getting a feel for what Palestinian society is thinking. There's another one, I'm actually a board member on a virtual think tank called Al-Shabake. Al-Shabake in English is the word network. Al-Shabake is a policy forum, and a lot of people say we don't hear from Palestinians. Well, if you go there, all the issues that are issues will be in 3 to 4 page policy briefs from Palestinians themselves. So you can start getting a feel for Palestinian opinion. And that's important because the majority of the West hears our opinion through their think tanks and their diplomats. Very few go out of their way because for a long period of time we didn't have English material, but now we have English material out there from Palestinian voices. Yes.
Can I just follow on from that then, Sam, please?
Yeah.
Because that's very interesting to know about, and it is, you know, is it going out to the different Palestine
Solidarity.
PSC, Palestine Solidarity campaigns in the different countries? Because
I would hope so, but
the discussions I've been in, and in all of our lobbying work that we're doing with, you know, other organizations within the UK, that information's not coming.
I will take that to the board. I mean, that's important for us to know.
I have to take that. Well, sorry, I'm very involved in networks within the UK, involved in lobbying. You know, we do coalition work as ICAD UK, and that
those opinions are not
those
there.
opinions aren't there at all. The only thing I can tell you that happened is that there was a conference this spring in SOAS, where it was called by PSC, the lessons we can learn from Gaza. And there were a number of Palestinian voices, some the same type of Palestinian people there. And they were saying, we don't want any more aid from anybody in the UK. We don't want any charity visits. We don't want anybody even coming here to tell us what to do. We're fed up with that. We've had it. We want political action. You know, you come here and you engage and do it meaningful, or just go and lobby your politician. That's what they.
I mean, there's a lot of frustration. I mean, I actually think they go together. I mean, I think, you know, being here and interacting is part of being able to mobilize in your own countries. But definitely, the weak spot that we have is lobbying governments directly. We don't have the resources, and to be honest with you, we don't have the mindset to lobby governments. This is a self-criticism, I'm included, we're comfortable in our solidarity world. Solidarity is one thing, civil society is one thing, hardcore dirty politics is where, unfortunately, decisions get made. And unless we're willing to roll up our sleeves and get into that debate, we're going to have a hard time affecting the policymakers. And I'm part of that. I mean, I don't like to go into that world either because it's a very sloppy and messy and very, you know, interest-oriented world. We're getting better at it. We're never going to be an APAC, but I don't think we need to be because I think there's different ways to organize. You don't just have to buy off congressmen, in the States at least. I mean, I actually think that policy is not made in capitals. Policy is made in communities. And if we can put enough pressure in communities, and we already have natural links within all communities. It doesn't work to sing about Bethlehem every Christmas if you don't understand that there's a wall around Bethlehem. Or Bethlehemites can't get to Jerusalem, or vice versa. So we have church communities, we have the youth, which are a strategic ally. And I honestly think we have more and more diaspora Jewish communities which are willing to mobilize on the right side of this conflict. Especially when we portray it in the proper way. We are not trying to bring Israel to its knees. We're trying to bring Israel in line with international law. And there's the voices that are out there, even within the Israeli community, like Breaking the Silence, or ICAD, or in the States you have Jewish Voice for Peace. These are small cracks, but they're getting larger and they're gaining traction, and they provide for the established Jewish community alternatives. Today in Israel you have probably almost 50 maybe, probably more, Israeli students who are refusing to serve in the military because of the occupation. That was unheard of only 10, 15 years ago. So there's a lot, actually on my, if you go to my website or blog or whatever, it's a pretty rudimentary thing, but there's a lot of information there. It's epalestine.com. On the right hand side, I actually have a section of all the Israeli human rights organizations that I think are worthy of focus on. And it means something when you take Israeli sources to your political debates in your country. Because at the end of the day, the Palestinians are saying that because they're lying, because they're trying to get something. But when Israelis are saying it too, it adds another level of confidence to the people that you're talking to. Yes, sir.
What about your own role in domestic politics here? Are you, other than the civil organization that you lead or get involved with, are
That's
you
a good
interested
question.
in
I haven't yet. And even if I wanted to, there's something we need to keep in mind. That one of the destructions of the Oslo process, one of the damages, the structural damages, the one that the US likes kind of to ignore, is that the political system has been not only disrupted, but frozen. If I today decide I want to create a political party and run for office, there's nowhere to go to sign up. There's no registration office for political parties. There's no political party law. There's no parliamentary that's in session. Partly due to Israeli actions, because at one point they arrested just enough members of our parliament to make sure that the parliament couldn't have quorum to meet. That was an act on the Israeli side. But there's also an act on the political side and on the Palestinian side. The Palestinian leadership today is acting on its own with no reference point of a political system. So when I speak, usually I say my opinion, or to be honest with you, my 13-year-old daughter's opinion is equally valid compared to the president's opinion. Because he can't say that people are behind him, nor can my 13-year-old daughter. The political system has frozen. Another reason to question the steps that the politicians are making if it can't be referenced to any kind of political system. And that's a huge weakness on the Palestinian side. And when I said we need to get our act together to be able to redefine our self-determination, that's what I was talking about. Bringing back together our political system in a fragmented way, because we're a fragmented people. That's a huge challenge, a huge one. But it's one that we have to take on as Palestinians.
And you see yourself play a role in that?
I hope not. I don't know. We'll see. Feel free to stay in touch. There's actually a mailing list that I have that you can find at that epalestine.com website. My email is there as well, and I warn you, I will reply to your email if you send me an email. Have a good trip, and thanks for coming to Bill.
Thank you, Sam. It was really, Sam comes every year and looks at the progress. I don't know if this is the